The door swung open, and the smell hit them first. Not decay, not rot. Something worse. Something lived in. Something hidden for far too
This is
long.
officer requesting backup
An
immediately.
officer stepped back, hand tightening on the radio.
Over.
Another covered their mouth.
We have reason to
Across the
believe there's an
hallway, a
immediate
man
threat.
stood
You need to
barefoot,
come with us now.
calm,
What's going on?
watching.
This is crazy.
He didn't flinch. He didn't ask questions. He simply said softly, "I was wondering when someone would come." What no one understood in that moment was that the danger had never arrived. It had been there the entire time. The street looked ordinary even then. Clean sidewalks, neatly trimmed hedges, cars parked in driveways like obedient pets. The kind of place where nothing ever happened, and everyone believed it would stay that way. People waved in the mornings, they borrowed sugar. They complained about the weather and laughed about nothing. Doors were left unlocked. Trust was casual, easy, almost lazy. Investigators would later struggle with that part the most. How normal everything looked, how quiet it was, how nothing screamed for attention. The house sat right in the middle of the block. Not too big, not too small. Paint still holding on. Lights that came on at the same time every evening. Inside lived someone who kept to a routine. Coffee at dawn. Shoes lined perfectly by the door. Music low. Curtains half open. A life built on predictability. And next door lived someone who noticed everything. The victim trusted routines. Trusted patterns. Trusted the idea that familiarity meant safety. Every morning I followed the same script. Wake up, check the phone, feed the cat. Step outside for a breath of air before the day swallows everything whole. There were dreams too. Quiet ones. The kind that didn't need to be spoken out loud to feel real. A plan to save more, to maybe leave one day. Or maybe just to finally feel settled. Neighbors saw kindness. A wave, a smile. Small talk that never crossed boundaries. Someone who listened more than they spoke. Someone who remembered details. Someone who offered help without being asked. What no one noticed was how closely those details were tracked. The victim had habits. Left at the same time every morning. Returned just after sunset. Took the trash out late. Always late. Always alone. There was comfort in that predictability. Comfort in knowing nothing ever changed. But that wasn't the most disturbing part. The disturbing part was how those habits slowly shifted. By minutes at first, then by hours. How the lights stayed on longer. How the music stopped. How the cat was heard crying through the walls at odd times. Neighbors assumed stress, work, life. Everyone had an excuse ready. Investigators would later realize those small changes were the only warnings they ever got. The first conversation that mattered didn't seem important at the time. It happened by the mailbox. Casual, forgettable. "Everything okay?" the neighbor asked, voice calm, friendly. "Yeah," the victim replied. "Just tired." "Let me know if you need anything." A smile, a nod. Nothing more. But what no one noticed was how the neighbor lingered after the victim walked away. How their eyes stayed fixed on the door long after it closed. How they counted the seconds before footsteps faded inside. At night, sounds traveled differently on the street. Doors opening, floors creaking, a car engine starting and stopping. Once, someone thought they heard voices through the wall. A conversation. Quiet, tense, then nothing. "It's probably the TV," someone said. And that explanation was enough. The victim had a way of trusting easily. Believed people were mostly good. Believed danger announced itself loudly. Believed monsters didn't live next door. What no one noticed was how often the neighbor offered to help. Fixing something, carrying groceries, watching the house, being available. Always available. But that wasn't the most disturbing part. The disturbing part was how the neighbor knew when not to knock. There were moments the victim felt watched. A glance through the window, a shadow moving just out of view. A sense that the silence was too intentional. Those thoughts were dismissed quickly. Nobody wants to believe they're unsafe in their own home. Fear was inconvenient, easier to ignore. Investigators would later find that fear written down, not in a journal, not in words, in patterns, missed calls, messages never sent. A door locked twice instead of once. Days passed. Then one day, the routine broke completely. The lights didn't turn off. Morning came. The cat cried. Packages stacked by the door. Music never played. The neighbor noticed immediately. Of course they did. They must be out of town, someone suggested. They probably forgot, another said. But that wasn't the most disturbing part. The disturbing part was how calm the neighbor was when asked if they'd seen anything. How easily they said no. How quickly they smiled. How normal they looked standing. There, arms crossed, leaning against the fence. That night, a smell drifted through the wall. Faint, easy to blame on garbage, or plumbing, or heat. Someone almost called it in. Almost. What if it's nothing, they said. And that was enough to stop them. Investigators would later say that was the moment everything could have changed. Instead, days passed. The cat grew quieter. And when the door was finally opened, when the truth could no longer be contained, the neighbors stood exactly where they always did. Watching, waiting, calm. What no one understood yet was that the man next door had never been hiding. He had been living normally. And the most terrifying part? This was only the beginning. The officers moved carefully through the house, voices low, radios crackling with half-finished sentences. Every step felt wrong, like they were trespassing on something that should have stayed buried. The neighbor watched from the doorway, arms relaxed, posture loose. He answered, questions without hesitation. How long have you lived here? Long enough. When did you last see them? Couple days ago, maybe more. His voice never wavered. What no one noticed was how precise his answers were. Not vague, not unsure, measured, as if rehearsed. Inside, the house told a story no one wanted to hear. Not chaos, not a struggle. Order, too much order. The victim's phone sat on the counter, screen dark. Shoes by the door, wallet untouched. The kind of scene that suggested they never planned to leave. Investigators would later realize that absence was louder than any scream. Neighbors gathered outside, whispering. Shock spread slowly, like a bruise blooming under skin. Someone cried. Someone asked questions no one could answer yet. And through it all, the neighbor stayed close. Offered water, offered blankets, told people to breathe. But that wasn't the most disturbing part. The disturbing part was how many people found comfort in him. He spoke softly to one of the officers. They were good people, he said. Kept to themselves. Didn't deserve whatever this is. Whatever this is. That phrase would come back later. The body was found tucked away. Hidden, but not rushed. Time had been taken. Care had been used. No rage, no panic, just intention. The room felt wrong, not violent, personal. Investigators exchanged looks. This wasn't random. What no one noticed was the neighbor's eyes drifting toward that room. Just for a second. Not fear, not surprise, ownership. The street changed overnight. Doors locked, curtains drawn, conversations dropped to whispers. Parents kept children inside. People replayed memories, searching for moments that suddenly felt dangerous. He was always so nice, someone said. He helped me with my car, another whispered. That doesn't mean anything, someone tried to argue. But doubt had already settled in. Investigators began knocking on doors, asking questions, mapping, routines, learning who knew what. When they reached the neighbor's house, he welcomed them in. "Of course," he said, "I want to help." Inside, everything was spotless. No clutter, no photos, no personality. It felt staged, though no one could say why. He offered coffee, sat calmly, answered everything. Did you ever argue with them? No. Ever feel uncomfortable around them? No. Did they trust you? I think so. That answer lingered. What no one noticed was how often he spoke in the past tense. Investigators would later realize something else too. His timeline didn't quite fit. He claimed he'd been home all night, alone, watching TV. But the shows he mentioned hadn't aired that evening. A small thing, easy to miss. But that wasn't the most disturbing part. The disturbing part was how easily he laughed it off when asked again. "Guess I mixed up the days," he said. "They blur together." They shouldn't have. As the investigation deepened, small details surfaced. A camera down the street. A blurry figure walking late at night. A shape moving between houses. Not enough to accuse, just enough to unsettle. Neighbors began to remember things differently. That smell. The noises. The way he always knew when they were home. Regret filled the gaps where certainty used to live. Investigators found messages on the victim's phone. Innocent at first glance, friendly, casual. Then slowly, a shift. Too many check-ins, too many questions, too much attention disguised as concern. What no one noticed became a phrase repeated in interviews. What no one noticed was how the neighbor always knew when the victim was alone. What no one noticed was how often he positioned himself between the victim and other neighbors. What no one noticed was how the victim slowly stopped inviting people over. But that wasn't the most disturbing part. The disturbing part was that the victim had tried to set boundaries, a message, polite, firm, asking for space. There was no reply. Instead, there was silence. Then the routine changed. Later nights, locked doors, nervous glances. Investigators would later find scratches on the neighbor's hands, thin, healing. He said it was from gardening. No dirt was found under his nails. The pressure began to build. Questions repeated, stories checked. The neighbor stayed calm, almost too calm. He attended a small vigil organized on the street, stood beside grieving neighbors, bowed his head, closed his eyes. Someone noticed he never cried. That night, investigators returned, this time with more intent, more focus. The neighbor opened the door again. "You've already been here," he said, smiling. "Did I forget something?" "Yes," an officer replied. "You forgot to tell us the truth." Silence stretched between them. For the first time, the neighbor's smile slipped. Just a little. And in that crack, something dark looked back. What no one realized yet was that the story they thought they were uncovering was only half of it. The motive was still buried, and the worst betrayal hadn't been revealed. The questions changed after that. They were no longer gentle, no longer polite. The neighbor noticed immediately. His posture stiffened, his answers shortened. He stopped offering coffee. Investigators would later say that was the moment the mask began to crack. They asked about the scratches again, about the nights he claimed to be home, about the messages on the victim's phone. "I was just being friendly," he said. "People misinterpret things." But that wasn't the most disturbing part. The disturbing part was how he framed everything as concern, as kindness, as something the victim should have been grateful for. "They were lonely," he said. "I was just trying to help." That word again. Help. Investigators pulled phone records, location data, patterns. A quiet picture began to form. The neighbor's phone moved when the victim's did, stopped when theirs stopped. went dark at the same time. Coincidence, he claimed. But coincidences don't stack that neatly. Neighbors were interviewed again. This time the questions cut deeper. Did he ever make you uncomfortable? Well, no, sometimes he stared. Did you ever hear arguing? Not arguing, talking, late, too late. Regret hung heavy in every answer. What no one noticed back then became painfully obvious now. The neighbor had positioned himself as the center of the block, the helper, the listener, the safe option. He knew who worked late, who lived alone, who wouldn't be missed right away. And the victim fit that picture perfectly. Investigators found something else. A key, hidden behind a loose panel in the neighbor's garage. It matched the victim's door. When asked about it, his breathing changed, just slightly. They gave it to me, he said, in case of emergencies. No, one else had one. That wasn't the most disturbing part. The disturbing part was that the lock on the victim's door showed no signs of forced entry. The house hadn't been broken into. It had been opened, pressure closed in. Interviews stretched longer. Silence replaced small talk. The neighbor stopped smiling. Late one night, an investigator sat across from him and asked quietly, "Did they trust you?" The neighbor looked up slowly. "Yes," he said. That was the problem. The room went still. Investigators would later replay that sentence over and over. Bit by bit, the truth surfaced. The neighbor had watched for months, noticed routines, learned habits, offered help until it became expected, until it became normal to let him in. The victim had trusted him, and trust had been weaponized. What no one noticed was how the neighbor reacted when boundaries were set, when the victim pulled away, when access was limited, when control slipped. Messages went unanswered. Doors stayed locked. Polite excuses replaced warm conversations. Rejection, quiet as it was, became unbearable. The escalation was slow, calculated. Conversations turned tense. The neighbor showed up uninvited, asked questions that felt too personal, lingered too long. The victim confided in no one. Didn't want drama, didn't want to be wrong, didn't want to believe the person next door could be dangerous. Investigators would later say that hesitation cost everything. The final night unfolded without witnesses, without screams, without chaos. The neighbor knocked. The victim opened the door, because of course they did. Inside, voices were heard through the wall, calm at first, then sharp, then quiet again. Shorter sentences, faster breathing, a pause, then nothing. The neighbor left just before dawn, walked back next door, cleaned up, showered, made coffee, fed his routine like nothing had happened. When the victim didn't answer messages the next day, he didn't panic. He waited, because he knew exactly where they were. What no one noticed was how he avoided looking at the victim's door after that, how he never knocked again, how he never asked questions. He already had the answers. When investigators finally confronted him with the evidence, the tone shifted completely. There was no anger, no denial, just exhaustion. "It wasn't supposed to go that far," he said. That was the moment the motive finally came into focus. It wasn't money, it wasn't rage, it wasn't impulse, it was control. He couldn't stand being shut out, couldn't stand losing access, couldn't stand being ordinary again. The neighbor who knew everything had been reminded that he meant nothing. And that realization snapped something permanent inside him. When they told him he was being arrested, he nodded, slowly, as if relieved. "I knew this would end eventually," he said. What no one expected was what he said next. "They never would have suspected me. If I'd just waited longer." The room fell silent, because in that sentence was the most chilling truth of all. He hadn't panicked. He had miscalculated. and the realization that he could have gotten away with it haunted everyone who heard it. The betrayal was complete. But the damage was just beginning. The arrest didn't bring relief the way people expected. There was no sudden release of fear, no sense that things were finally okay. Instead, the street felt hollow, like something had been taken from it that could never be returned. Neighbors stood behind curtains as the neighbor was led out in handcuffs. Some cried, some stared, some refused to look at all. The man who had fixed fences and carried groceries walked past them without resistance, without emotion. He glanced once at the house next door. Just once, not with guilt, not with sadness, with something closer to disappointment. What no one noticed was how carefully he avoided eye contact with everyone else. The trial unraveled the rest of the truth slowly, painfully. The victims' routines were laid out in front of strangers. Their habits, their messages, their trust. Every small kindness was turned into evidence. Family members sat in silence, gripping each other's hands, hearing how someone they loved had been studied like a schedule, how their life had been reduced to patterns and opportunities. The neighbor listened without reaction. He didn't look back, didn't apologize, didn't cry. When asked why, he answered simply, "They didn't listen." That sentence shattered the room, because the truth was the victim had listened too much, listened to excuses, listened to reassurances, listened to the voice that said, "Don't overreact." Investigators would later say the case haunted them not because of the violence, but because of how avoidable it felt in hindsight. How many moments existed where a different choice might have changed everything? A door locked sooner, a call made, a boundary enforced. But that wasn't the most disturbing part. The disturbing part was how easily it could happen again. The verdict came back guilty. Life without release. The courtroom exhaled, but closure never arrived. It never does. The house next door stayed empty. Windows dark, paint peeling. People avoided walking past it. Children crossed the street without being told. The fence between the two houses was removed, but the space it left felt wider than ever. The victim's family returned once, just once. They stood outside the home where so many normal days had passed, where trust had lived, where safety had been assumed. Inside, one detail stopped them cold. A small mark on the wall, almost invisible, a place where the victim had marked height changes over the years. Quiet proof of a life moving forward, growing, planning. It ended inches from the floor. That mark stayed with everyone who saw it. Years later, neighbors still spoke in lowered voices about that time, about how they questioned every smile afterward, how kindness began to feel suspicious, how safety stopped feeling permanent. One woman said, "The worst part is knowing he watched us grieve." Another said, "He knew everything about us, and we knew nothing about him." And that was the final truth. The killer didn't hide in shadows. He didn't live on the fringes. He didn't look dangerous. He lived next door. He waved. He helped. He waited. And no one suspected a thing. If this story unsettled you, it should. Because the most dangerous threats rarely announce themselves. They blend in. They earn trust. They wait for silence. If stories like this matter to you, if you believe these echoes should never be forgotten, take a moment to like this video. It helps more people hear stories that deserve to be told. Subscribe if you want more true crime that digs beneath the surface, without shortcuts, without sensationalism. And let us know in the comments, do you think you would have noticed the signs?